Hey everyone, welcome to another lecture. Last time we ended PowerPoint 7 by discussing several things, right? We discussed um, a couple of slave rebellions that both failed. Um, the first, of course, was Denmark Vesey, who was stopped before his slave rebellion even began, because remember, he tried to do it on Bastille Day, the day when France started the French Revolution officially. Because a couple of slaves snitched on the whole operation, so he was hung before he even committed a revolution, right? We also discussed family life and what black families look like, even though they could be easily torn apart and sold away from each other. And we also discussed Nat Turner's rebellion, which was more successful because he and his cohorts ended up killing about 60 white men, women, and children. However, they were eventually caught and he was hung. And rules against slaves increased after that because the white planters were super paranoid about a rebellion happening to them. And we finally finished that lecture by discussing what slavery in the cities looked like. And how some of them had a little bit more freedom, having their own communities right outside the city, and others had to literally sleep at the foot of the bed of their masters. So it really depended. So now we're starting PowerPoint 8, which will be Free Blacks in America. Now, this is kind of a mixed bag. We've already talked about free blacks several times. So some of this stuff will be about free blacks, but we're also going to move into escaping from slavery, right? Running away. That's going to be sort of the second half of this PowerPoint. We're going to get in more detail about that in our next lecture. So this is like a picture I've shown to you guys before, if you didn't catch it in the last lecture in Slavery in the Cities. You could see this, but I want to talk about the disenfranchisement of free black people, okay, who often lived in the city like these free slaves. So firstly, disenfranchisement means that you are disenfranchised, which means that you are not given the same, treatment as others, right? So you're unfairly oppressed compared to other people around you. That's disenfranchisement. As you can see in this picture, this black man maybe was minding his own business, and these two white men are pointing guns at him and harassing him. So that was pretty typical. Free Southern blacks continued to live under the shadow of slavery, unable to travel or assemble as freely as those in the North. It was also more difficult for them to organize and sustain churches, schools, or fraternal orders. Free blacks throughout the South were banned from possessing firearms or preaching the Bible. We've kind of discussed that before. Later laws even prohibited Negroes who went out of state to get an education from returning. In many states, the slave codes that were designed to keep African Americans in bondage were also applied to free persons of color. We're going to get into that as well when we get to the Reconstruction period. Most horrifically, free blacks could not testify in court. If a slave catcher claimed that a free African American was a slave, the accused could not defend himself in court, which doesn't make sense, right? If you're a free black person, you're not a slave. So why shouldn't you be able to testify in court? Well, the thing too was that free black people were not citizens. So you didn't have the same rights as white citizens. So they could get away with making these rules. Again, we'll discuss that later too. The church suffered brutalities and massive arrest of its membership, clearly an indication of the fear of black solidarity. Many of these leaders became die-hard abolitionists. Most lived in poverty, but in a few cities such as New Orleans, Charleston, and Baltimore, some worked as skilled carpenters, shoemakers, tailors, and millwrights. Although free blacks comprised no more than 3.8% of the population of any northern state, they faced mounting legal, economic, and social discrimination. They were prohibited from marrying whites, were relegated to segregated jails, cemeteries, asylums, and schools. All but 4 New England states denied them the right to vote. So really, You're free in the sense that you could go and potentially make your own money. You can kind of live where you choose to a certain extent. You aren't going to be whipped and tortured for not doing a good job. But other than that, you still face a lot of the same stuff as you did when you were a slave. Okay. And again, as we discussed before, right, this was deliberate because they want to show the slaves, well, they not only want to show the slaves that life isn't that much better when you're free, but also they want to show the free blacks that just because they're free, it doesn't mean that they're equal, that they're still black no matter what. Here's a free black woman at the time, and what she would have worn during the antebellum period, again, the period before the Civil War. By the 1830s, they began to suffer heightened competition from white immigrants in the skilled trades and even in such traditional occupations such as domestic service. So basically, what that means is that in the 1830s, but even before that, the 1830s is really when the Industrial Revolution starts to kick off, right? You're getting things invented like railroads and factories and steamships, right? And you need people to build those and operate those. In places like Ireland, which had the potato famine, and Eastern European countries, and maybe Greece and Italy and stuff, there are a lot of people who wanted to immigrate to the United States because they saw a lot of opportunity and a lot of booming industry. So now free blacks are in competition with European immigrants who are more likely to get the jobs because they're white. And this would be a problem that would continue until we had equal employment in the 1960s when we started getting that. But until then, there was this huge amount of competition that free blacks had to deal with. And they would get discriminated against by the white immigrants because the white business owners would tell them, like, hey, the reason why you're not getting this job is because those black people work for cheap. So the white immigrants would be like, oh, well, then we don't like them because they're taking our jobs, right? So there's that, traditional beef, like that's where some of these things got started. Money, they say money is the root of all evil. And then some free blacks ended up living near their former plantations. Maybe they were too scared to move up north. Maybe they didn't have a lot of skills, so they worked near what they were used to. Or maybe they had family members that were still slaves and they wanted to be near them. There's various excuses as to why you would stick around to the place that caused you so much pain. If you take a look at video A, this video talks about white northerners versus free blacks. So this professor actually talks a little bit more about how white northerners treated free blacks. And again, there's this unfair assumption that although the South was very racist because they really believed in the institution of slavery, that just because the northerners wanted to get rid of slavery, that they weren't racist against black people, which is absolutely not true. Right? For example, the city of Boston in the 50s and 60s was one of the last places that accepted the desegregation of schools. Dr. King in the 60s went to Chicago and said it was one of the most racist places he's ever been to at the time. So you can't really necessarily draw the line in the sand between North and South as far as racism. And here's another example of a job that you might get. You could be a barber, right, which is a occupation that, has really been a part of the black community, right? The barber shops nowadays run by black men, they can go in there, they can talk shit, whatever, but it started off as a necessity to become a barber because it was a fairly decent trade to learn. You could make some good money, and just basically you had to get whatever kind of job you could get. So the next two topics we're going to talk about have to deal with schools, right? Something that you guys are in right now, and something that our country really depends on as far as raising future leaders and workers and just citizens in general. So, of course, if they discriminate heavily against free black people, they're not going to allow them to attend the same schools as white children. So, they had to establish their own schools, like that kind of look like the picture in this example, right? Sort of like the free churches, you have that colonial style building with the round window in the middle, right? Again, you can see these a lot on the East Coast still. So let's talk about what sort of elementary, middle, high school look like. But there really weren't a lot of established high schools and things like that, just because a lot of free black people did not have a lot of access to higher education for a long time. So they basically would just go to these schools to learn a trade or learn to read and write and then go out and get a job, right? There wasn't really a doctors, lawyers, all that stuff to aspire to for a long time. So in the 1780s, a group called the Pennsylvania Society for Promoting the Abolition of Slavery, aka PAS, took on anti-slavery tasks. They helped former slaves with educational and economic aid. They also helped with legal obligations, like making sure they didn't get sold back into slavery. Another anti-slavery group, called the New York Manumission Society, or NYMS, did many things towards the abolition of slavery. One important thing they did was establish a school for free blacks. So they established this around 1787 and enrolled about 100 to 200 students annually during the first 2 decades of its existence, registering a total of 800 pupils by 1822. So there was a large demand for schools like this. The PAS also instituted a few schools for the free blacks and also had them run only by freed African Americans. They were taught reading, writing, grammar, math, and geography. The schools would have an annual examination day to show the public, parents, and donors the knowledge the students had gained. It mainly was to show the white population that African Americans could function in society. So it's sort of like, you guys, I don't know if you guys still have at the high school level parent-teacher day or, parent day where your parents come and see what the hell you've been doing at school, right? Or mostly in elementary school they do that. Basically, imagine if you had to do parent day, but also to prove to the rest of the town that you're smart enough to get a job there eventually. That's basically what it was. There are some surviving records of what they learned in the free school. Some of the work showed that they were preparing the students for a middle-class standing in society. The African Free School provided education for blacks in New York City for more than 6 decades. By 1865, as many as 9% of slaves attained at least a marginal degree of literacy, which is pretty good, right? This is like, it's around 9%. It's more like 7 to 9%, but that's like the total black population, really. So that's very low literacy. That's what they would focus on doing for the next 100 or so years, is getting a lot of black people who are literate to read and write so that they could vote. So if you take a look at video B, there's a short video about the African Free School, which shows, I think, some artifacts from the school as well. You didn't have laptops, even notebooks and pens, right? You just have a chalkboard and a little bit of chalk, and you'd have to remember what the hell you learned a month ago in your lessons. So here's an example of what the classroom looked like. You sat on benches. You didn't have your own individual desks most of the time. That's very expensive. And usually you try to have free black teachers, but sometimes they'd have white women teach as well. And these women, we'll talk about the Reconstruction period, also were largely the force who taught free black people how to read and write after emancipation. Slaves were secretly practicing their reading and writing skills when they had time alone, mostly at night. Slaves then passed on their newly learned skills to others. So sometimes these slaves would take it upon themselves to learn. However, if your master caught you, right, they could sell you or torture you or do stuff like that. because they don't want smart slaves who can evade work or run away or cause a rebellion. Like, they absolutely don't want that. In the movie 12 Years a Slave, which we'll talk about today too, right? The Solomon Northup was educated free black man, so he had to hide the fact that he was smart or he could have been killed. African American preachers would often attempt to teach some of the slaves to read in secret, but there were very few opportunities for concentrated periods of instruction. Through spiritual stories and other forms of oral literacy, meaning that you tell stories by word of mouth instead of reading them, which is an ancient African tradition, preachers, abolitionists, and other community leaders imparted valuable political, cultural, and religious information. Okay, so that's how you would go to school if you are a free black or rarely enslaved person at the time. But again, it was very difficult for the slaves to learn. So this is sort of like a corner street view of one of these schools. I always think this is super interesting because like Paris kind of looks like that, where the buildings are sort of shaped like when you turn a corner, it kind of looks like a triangle. And we based a lot of our initial architecture on Europe because that's what we were familiar with. Okay, so we talked about sort of elementary, middle, high school type hybrid schools, right? Now we'll talk about universities. Now, this gets closer to the Civil War, although I feel like we should talk about it now just because we're on the same theme of free blacks going to school. Okay. So here's an example of a historically black college. Historically black colleges still exist today. I got my master's degree from Howard University, which is considered to be one of the top historically black colleges in the country. So let's talk about them and why there was a need for them to be founded. Okay. So historically black colleges are traditionally also called HBCUs, just to abbreviate. So they are institutions of higher education founded prior to 1864 for African American students. The term was created by the Higher Education Act of 1965, which expanded federal funding for colleges and universities. So we didn't really get the term historically black colleges until much later. The first HBCUs were founded in Pennsylvania and Ohio before the American Civil War, with the purpose of providing black youths, who were largely prevented due to racial discrimination from attending established colleges and universities, with a basic education and training to become teachers or tradesmen. So they're more like trade schools, right? The trade school, of course, maybe some of you are thinking of joining a trade school when you're older, is basically teaching you a specific skill. Okay, there's trade schools for teaching, welding, electric work, all kinds of stuff. The Institute for Colored Youth, briefly the African Institute at its founding, opened on a farm outside Pennsylvania in 1837. It is today Cheyney University of Pennsylvania, which is part of the Pennsylvania state system of higher education. And as you can see from this picture, there's Cheyney University's sign. The Ashman Institute, also located near Philadelphia, provided theological training as well as basic education from its founding in 1854. It became Lincoln University in 1866 in honor of U.S. President Abraham Lincoln. The oldest private HBCU in the U.S. was founded in 1856 when the Methodist Episcopal Church opened Wilberforce University in Tawawa Springs, which is present-day Wilberforce, Ohio, as a coeducational institute for blacks who had escaped slavery in the South through the Underground Railroad. It closed in 1862, but reincorporated in 1863 under the church. Following the end of the Civil War and the abolition of slavery, HBCUs were founded throughout the South with support from the Freedmen's Bureau, which we'll talk about later. They basically work to help the freed slaves get integrated into society. Such institutions such as Atlanta University, now Clark Atlanta University, Howard University, which I went to, and Morehouse College, which another Delta professor, Professor Wade, who teaches this class as well, he graduated from Morehouse, provided a liberal arts education and trained students for careers as teachers or ministers and missionaries, while others focused on preparing students for industrial or agricultural occupations. So again, it's basically focusing them on things that they can do, right? Working in farming, maybe teaching, maybe preaching, things like that, right? They're not shooting for like president, right? Because it's not even in their scope, right? Politics, all that stuff, no. We will talk about it during the Reconstruction period, our last PowerPoint, where briefly Black people were allowed to participate in politics and things like that for about a decade, and then that was largely shut down. Most of these schools are co-educational, and they always have been, meaning that the boys and girls could go to the same school. The growth of HBCUs spurred controversy among prominent African Americans in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Some critics noted that many HBCUs, particularly those existing in the years immediately following the Civil War, were founded by whites, many of whom had negative preconceptions of the social, cultural, and intellectual capabilities of blacks. So Howard was founded by a white general, and so the black leadership felt like these universities were kind of discredited because they were founded by white donors who did not understand that black people could be really smart, even though they donated to this university. As blacks were generally barred, particularly in the South, from established institutions, critics questioned whether separate schools in fact hindered efforts towards social and economic equalities with whites. So they argued that because black people were founding their own universities, because they couldn't get into the white ones, that the separation means that they won't not only achieve equality, but they'll have a their education will be lesser than the whites. So interesting. Another issue is whether vocational training or a more classically intellectual education would best serve the interests of African Americans. This argument would really culminate with two prominent black leaders. If you are interested in checking them out, we're not going to talk about them in this class, but Booker T. Washington, who was the president of the Tuskegee Institute, another black institution, believed that we should do trade schools and do certain skills. W.E.B. Du Bois, one of the foremost thinkers in black history, believed that we should, study liberal arts and science and all that stuff, higher education. So they battled about that in the early 1900s. The institutionalization of racial segregation both within and outside the South made it even more difficult for black students to study anywhere other than in HBCUs until the mid-20th century, when we had the Civil Rights Movement. In the early 21st century, there were more than 100 HBCUs in the U.S., predominantly in the South. Some are two-year schools, but most are four-year schools. Many prominent people have graduated from HBCUs, right, including actress Taraji P. Henson, actor Chadwick Boseman, P. Diddy briefly went to Howard. I think Nick Cannon's still going there. I think he started when I was there. And then Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall, the first black Supreme Court justice that we've ever had, graduated from Howard University. And, there have been a bunch of prominent leaders who went to black colleges. Yeah, they still continue today. Video C is basically introducing a documentary that was made about HBCUs, so check out the clips and stuff. And the reason we still have HBCUs is not only because they're good institutions with great professors, but they also have a large, rich history of black excellence. But it's not only black people, anybody's welcome, it's just historically black. So, just saying, like, if you're not black, you can go to HBCU. If you're fine with being the minority for once, basically, because there'll be mostly black people there. And also, it's just because of that, right? Because black people traditionally are in institutions where they only make up a small percent. So going to a historically black college means seeing people like you everywhere you walk, which is pretty cool in my opinion. I had a great time. And here are the logos for a bunch of HBCUs that still are, here today. Don't ask me to list all of them, I can't. But if you want to go to HBCU, you have to go. They're in the South and the East Coast, so you'd have to move across the country. Okay, so our last topic today, I've talked about him several times and his movie just because it was excellent. It's a great example, very well done. But now we're going to end today talking about Solomon Northup and how he was kidnapped into slavery and forced to be a slave for 12 years of his life. This is actor Chiwetel Ejiofor, British actor who played Solomon Northup in the movie. Yeah, he didn't get an Oscar for that year, which I was really bummed about. I think Matthew McConaughey got it for Dallas Buyers Club, which was a good performance, But this movie did win Best Oscar. So Solomon Northup was born July 10th, 1807 or 1808. We're not quite sure, and we do not know when he died. Okay? And this is a picture that they drew of him for the cover of his book, 12 Years a Slave. We'll talk about why we don't know when he died. So if you want to take a look at video D, they asked a bunch of residents in the town where Northup lived with his wife and his children before he was kidnapped if they knew who he was. And most of them said no. And this is right around the time that the movie came out, too. So it's just to show you guys that history is largely lost with people. So Solomon Northup was an American abolitionist and the primary author of the memoir 12 Years a Slave. A freeborn African American from New York, he was the son of a freed slave and a free woman of color. So none of his parents were slaves. He wasn't a slave, right? He was a free man. A farmer and professional violinist, Northup had been a landowner in Hebron, New York. In 1841, he was offered a traveling musician's job and went to Washington, D.C., where slavery was legal. There he was drugged, kidnapped, and sold as a slave. So you'll see in the movie, basically a couple guys tricked him into going to a place where they could beat him and kidnap him and sell him into slavery. And remember, we just talked about how free black people could not speak in court on their own behalf. So he was screwed when this happened. He was shipped to New Orleans, purchased by a planter, and held as a slave for 12 years in the Red River region of Louisiana, mostly in Avoyelles Parish. He remained a slave until he met a Canadian working on his plantation who helped get word to New York, where state law provided aid to free New York citizens who had been kidnapped and sold into slavery. So New York actually had a very great initiative where they would work to make sure that these free black people could come back, right? Which, he got lucky in that regard. The Canadian man is played by Brad Pitt in the movie. His family and friends enlisted the aid of the governor of New York, Washington Hunt, and Northup gained his freedom on January 3rd, 1853. And here's a depiction of a woman being captured, right, just to show sort of the terror. The slave trader in Washington, D.C., James H. Birch, was arrested and tried, but acquitted because District of Columbia law prohibited Northup as a black man from testifying against white people. So again, even when they had his accuser up on the stand and he could identify him, they wouldn't let him. Doesn't seem like much of a trial, right, guys? Later in New York State, his northern kidnappers were located and charged, but the case was tied up in court for 2 years because of jurisdictional challenges, and finally dropped when Washington, D.C. was found to have jurisdiction. The D.C. government did not pursue the case. Those who had kidnapped and enslaved Northup received no punishment. In his first year of freedom, Northup wrote and published a memoir, 12 Years a Slave, in 1853. He lectured on behalf of the abolitionist movement, giving more than 24 speeches throughout the Northeast about his experiences to build momentum against slavery. He largely disappeared from historical record after 1857, although a letter later reported him alive in early 1863. Some commentators thought he had been kidnapped again, but historians believe it unlikely, as he would have been considered too old to bring a good price. So basically, we don't know how he died because he disappeared from the public after a few years of touring around the country and telling his story and trying to get people to care more about getting rid of slavery, right? Because as a man who was forced to do it for 12 years, he had a lot to say. So if you ever want to read the book, it'd be an interesting but very hard read. So the last video for today, video E, is the official trailer for 12 Years a Slave, so you can check that out and see if you want to watch the movie if you've never seen it before, but I recommend it. I actually watched it in a theater when I was studying in England, and I was the only African American in the theater, and everybody was like gasping and in shock during the movie, like, oh my god, I can't believe this happened, and I just sort of sat there and nodded because I'm like, well, like, African Americans know that this happened, so I wasn't really shocked. So here is a small passage from 12 Years a Slave, just to give you a taste. So Northup said, "Suffice it to say, during the whole long day, I came not to the conclusion even once that the Southern slave, fed, clothed, whipped, and protected by his master, is happier than the free colored citizen of the North. To that conclusion I have never since arrived." So it's sort of, he's debunking that myth that we talked about with the Nat Turner Rebellion, how the slave owners tried to argue that slaves were much happier in servitude because they weren't smart, they were children, blah, 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 right? Northup's saying that's absolutely not true. And here is what the book looked like, basically. So there's the same picture I pointed out, and this is the formal cover page for his book, which I believe you can find it online for free, just because some books, they're old enough where you can get them for free because maybe the family doesn't own rights to them anymore, or there's no family members anymore, stuff like that. Copywriting laws are complicated. So that's the end of today's lecture. As I mentioned, next time we're going to, I think, finish PowerPoint 8. Yeah, we're going to finish it by talking about how the slaves escaped. The primary method is the Underground Railroad, so obviously we're going to talk about that, and we're going to talk about two prominent black women, and we're also going to talk about a couple that managed to escape as well. So lots of different stories and big characters to talk about next time.